Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. In Woodlawn Cemetery, where Dorothy Parker's ashes finally reached their resting place more than 50 years after she died. The strange posthumous odyssey of Dorothy Parker, as told by the man who brought her home. Next. I'm here at the Woolworth Chapel at Woodlawn Cemetery with Kevin Fitzpatrick, the founder of the Dorothy Parker Society. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Tony.
If there is a more ardent admirer, Kevin, of Dorothy Parker, that person is not on this planet.
Well, I was told by her biographer that I am her representative on planet Earth, so I thank you.
Well, you've been representing pretty well, judging by that website and all you've done so far for her. How did it come about, this love for Dorothy Parker?
Tony, in the 1990s, a friend gave me a biography of Parker, and I was looking for a research project about books, history, and New York. And I realized that she and I had a lot in common. We both lived on the same street on the Upper West Side, both are working in writing, had bad relationships, bad jobs, bad apartments. And so I thought by researching her life, that could become a website, which dorothyparker.com launched in 1998. Then the following year, started doing walking tours, and that led to the Dorothy Parker Society.
You're aware, of course, there are some people who think you've gone way overboard on this.
But you know, if someone was a Yankees fan and knew every lineup going back 100 years, that wouldn't be seen as too unusual. So knowing the names of all the Algonquin Roundtable members is kind of the same kind of obsession for me.
There's a line about your wife's feeling about how much you put into this.
My wife didn't realize when we met that there was another woman in my life.
Aha.
And this has been kind of the side project through the 18 years of our marriage, and culminating with Mrs. Parker coming back to New York and going into Woodlawn Cemetery. And we figured out that there's an empty spot next to Dorothy Parker, and I think Christina wanted to push me into that hole when this is all going on.
Yeah, okay, I get that. I imagine you can quote the epitaph on the tombstone.
Yes, well, Parker wrote about 5 or 6 different epitaphs, and the family chose the one that they wanted to see put on the gravestone, which comes from the poem Epitaph for a Darling Lady, and it's the last 4 lines, which go, "Leave for her a red young rose, go your way and save your pity. She is happy, for she knows that her dust is very pretty."
Perfect, isn't it?
Well, hopefully that will mean there'll be a run on roses in the Bronx coming to the gravestone rather than anything else.
Well, how about the run on roses and how people coming to visit? The gravestone's been there a couple of months now. What kind of traffic has there been?
Well, people have been sending in pictures and posting on Instagram. They bring flowers. They have had a toast there. They've been leaving little pebbles on the gravestone, so it's really become an attraction.
She, as you said, Kevin, she wrote, I don't know, half a dozen epitaphs, and one of the ones that is said to have been her favorite is, "If you can read this, you're standing too close." Perfect self-deprecating wit by Ms. Parker.
There's that one, and also one she wrote for Vanity Fair, which was "Excuse My Dust," which was very popular. But the family wanted to go a little bit more traditional, and because we had the room on the gravestone, why not have part of one of her poems?
Yeah, I just wonder about that other epitaph, "If you can read this, you're standing too close." It seems she used her lethal wit as a defense mechanism, kind of keep people at a distance. How do you see that?
Well, she was very witty and very funny, but to me, you know, her short fiction and some of her poetry, it's a little more deadly and a little bit more well-crafted. So while she does get remembered for being fun and funny, I think the more serious things get a lot of attention as well, too.
Let's talk about another quote of hers. She called herself a disagreeable child with stringy hair and a yen to write poetry.
Well, she was the youngest of four. She grew up on the Upper West Side. Her mother passed away right before she turned 5 years old, and then her stepmother died when she was 9. So it was really her and her father together, and they both wrote poetry back and forth to each other. They exchanged poems. She never graduated from high school, never went to college, but she was a voracious reader and writer starting at a very young age. So she started working in publishing in her early 20s and really made her living, just like she thought of herself as like a bricklayer. You know, these words are just words on a page to generate enough income to live on, and that was her goal.
I think she wrote, what, something like 300 poems.
She did not have a huge output. She wrote around 300 poems, about 50 short stories, a couple dozen screenplays, a few Broadway shows, and that was pretty much it, and a couple of songs as well, too.
Yeah, she wrote the lyrics to I Wished on the Moon.
Which we sang right here. We performed, Kate Manning sang that song right here, which is really nice.
I wish on the moon for something I never knew.
If you're a fan of cabaret, which I am, many artists perform that song. It's a tender, sweet ballad.
Nobody remembers the movie it's from, but the song has kind of lived on.
Yeah. What's your favorite among her writing?
I'm a fan of the short fiction. Her short stories that she wrote for The New Yorker and other magazines really have stood the test of time. Things like Big Blonde, Telephone Call, Arrangement in Black and White, which is about social justice, which played in a whole big part of her life. Those which I think will never go out of style.
She had a messy life, and a friend said she had an affinity for distress, and she sure had plenty of distress in her life. Let's talk about that.
Sure. So she got married young. Her first husband, Eddie Parker, promptly went off to World War I. He was an ambulance driver, saw a lot of heavy combat in France. When he came home in 1919, their relationship started to fall apart. They divorced in 1927, and that was really the darkest part of her life, having at least 3 suicide attempts, struggling with depression. Then in the early 30s is when she remarried to a guy named Alan Campbell, who really took care of her, and he really was the love of her life. And that really gave her the strength to continue writing short fiction, to go to Hollywood, become a highly paid screenwriter. And so that really was, what really kept her going throughout the 30s and 40s.
And with that second husband, they went to Hollywood. Did very well.
They did very well. They were pulling down big bucks during the Depression, writing comedies. They wrote the original screenplay to Star is Born. They were nominated for an Academy Award. They had a really good working relationship where he would set up the scenario and he'd say, now what does the wife say? And so Parker would sit there and come up with the dialogue. And so they're very highly paid and really popular too.
And as you said, Oscar nomination for A Star is Born. She drank, and those of us who don't know Dorothy Parker as well as you, haven't investigated, haven't read as much, think of her as one of those 20s roaring kind of person who had a drinking problem. But she said, I'm not a writer with a drinking problem, I'm a drinker with a writing problem.
But that was the era, and that was her friends. They would go to work, then go to a speakeasy, go to a show, go to a speakeasy. Everybody drank. She had a very long life. She lived to be 73. But, having an affinity for scotch and highballs was kind of her trademark. What I love is that now that, fans of her writing and fans of her, there's actually a Dorothy Parker gin that's made in Brooklyn, and that kind of is like celebrated for her affinity for martinis, which is really fun to talk about too.
Still being made and selling well?
10 years. It's been around 10 years. It's distributed all over the world. We go there every August for her birthday party at the distillery and have a toast.
On the 22nd, is
August
it?
22nd,
August
yes.
22nd. Let's get to the story, the long and winding saga of her wandering ashes.
Well, this has happened to other people. Other people have had their remains moved, people like Flo Ziegfeld and...
But not 53 years.
No. No, what happened, Tony, is she returned to New York in 1964 from many years in Hollywood and did her last will and testament. But a couple of things happened. One, she had a bad lawyer who wrote a bad will. And the will, although she did say she wanted to be cremated and did not want to have a funeral, nowhere in the will does it say anything about a cemetery. Also, her executrix was Lillian Hellman, who was a close friend of hers, who was unknown to her, was not going to be included in the will because she left her estate to Dr. King. You got to think
She left,
her estate to Martin Luther King Jr.
why?
She was a big champion for social justice and civil rights going all the way back to the 1920s. And you got to think in 1964, he was in the news every single day for Selma, for marches, for protests. So when she sat down and did her will, she said, I'm leaving my estate to him. She had no children, she had no husband anymore, so she left the estate to him. When she died in 1967 and the will was read, Hellman saw that she was left out. She was not left any money. So that upset her so much that she did not fulfill her duties as an executor. So Parker was cremated, and then her ashes were never claimed. So they stayed at the crematorium for 6 years. Finally,
Really? 6?
6 years in a box on a shelf. So then they finally said, we're going to have to do something with those. So they looked at her attorney's office where where the will had been executed, and they sent it to her attorney's office, which is where they sat until 1988. Paul O'Dwyer was the partner of her late attorney.
So Dorothy Parker's ashes sit for 6 years in a shelf where?
In Westchester County, in
Okay.
Hartsdale.
In Westchester County. Then finally they get transferred to the lawyer,
At 100 Broadway.
and the partner of that lawyer was Paul O'Dwyer, the same person we know, many New Yorkers know as the city council.
Yes.
Former city council president.
Yes.
And what happens there?
They sat in his filing cabinet until the biographer Marion Mead went down there when she's working on her book, and he says, oh, by the way, she's not in a cemetery, she's in my filing cabinet. So
It's
then
tragic. It's
then Liz Smith gets involved, the famous gossip columnist.
Sure.
So she writes about this, and that starts the ball moving.
How many years are we in now? Let's say when
We're past 20 years. This is 1988. So
Okay.
she's been dead 21 years.
okay.
So what happens next is King was assassinated a year after Parker's death, and so the estate rolled over to the NAACP. And so to this day, the NAACP collects the royalties on all of her writing, which is really nice. And so they said, we're going to claim the remains. And so the NAACP brought the urn from the Algonquin Hotel to Baltimore, Maryland, where they have their national headquarters. And they built
The urn was at the Algonquin?
for a party. They brought it there for a party. Of course, why not? It's Dorothy
Who
Parker.
brought it there for?
Paul O'Dwyer did.
Really?
Yes. So he turned the urn over to the NAACP. They took her to Baltimore, Maryland. They built a wonderful memorial garden outside their national headquarters. And that's where she sat from 1988 to 2020.
Wow. We are now at 2020. We're what, 53 years
Yes.
after her death?
Yes. So what happened is the family, who was never consulted about any of this, her grandnieces and grandnephews, who still live in New York State, were never consulted or notified or anything. So they've felt very poorly about this for more than 50 years. So that's when they stepped in to say, okay, if anything changes with the NAACP memorial or anything, we would like to bring her back to Woodlawn Cemetery. So what Woodlawn did 15 years ago is they examined the records and figured out that Dorothy Parker is the plot owner for her parents' and grandparents' plot here in Woodlawn Cemetery. that she legally can come here and they have a space for her to go next to her parents. So once all those pieces were in place, then I was able to approach the NAACP and say, the family wants her brought back to New York. The cemetery is eager and willing to have a place for her. If anything changes with the Memorial Garden, we're ready. So Tony, what happened is the NAACP did move. They're still in Baltimore, but they're in an office building. So they left the Memorial Garden, left Parker at the garden, and they moved out. So last year, I went down with a box, and we removed her from the ground and brought her back to New York.
Wait a minute. You went down to Baltimore to the NAACP
Yes.
Memorial Garden.
Yes.
And they exhumed Dorothy
Yes.
Parker.
With a shovel, a pickaxe, an air hammer. She was really in there really good.
And you had a box.
Yes, I brought a pine
little-
box from New York.
Oh.
I didn't want to carry her in a fresh direct bag, you know. I wanted to, I wanted to bring her back in the train in something nice.
You came on what, Amtrak?
I took Amtrak, yes.
With a pine box last year in the midst of the pandemic,
Pre-vaccine,
pre-vaccine.
so it's very
You
quiet.
and Dorothy on the Acela, I hope.
It wasn't even that, it was the local. It was a slow train. It was me, Mrs. Parker, and a gin and tonic. And, brought her back to New York. She had her first Uber ride. She got to visit her old stomping grounds in the Upper West Side. Stayed at our place for a few nights, and then brought her here on her birthday in 2020.
And she was interred in the plot.
Yes, so Woodlawn did a really nice thing. They put a tent up because it was raining. There's only 10 of us here because of the pandemic. The NAACP sent Dr. Hazel Dukes, the former chairman of the New York State chapter of the NAACP. She spoke. Woodlawn Cemetery's historian Susan Olson spoke. I said something. My friend Bill Zeffro sang "I Wished Upon a Moon" for her at the graveside, and we put her in the ground next to her mother.
So she's finally at rest in the ground, but there's no headstone.
Yes.
Another saga.
Operation. Well, Tony, what happened is the family, they're wonderful people, they were ready to put a gravestone in, but then the fans spoke up and said, we want to help too. We want to donate money. How can we support this? So then when the family said, okay, we will accept, donations, let's have something a little bit grander, we thought, well, what can we do for the fans, to get them to get behind this? We said, well, we can make a special batch of gin, Dorothy Parker gin. The Al Hirschfeld Foundation said, well, we'll make T-shirts with the Al Hirschfeld caricature of Parker. And so then the money started coming in, and we were able to get a really gorgeous gravestone, which was unveiled on her birthday this year.
It's an impressive headstone, and you were successful 54 years after her death to finally not only have her in her plot, but for it to be marked.
And also, it's such a nice place. I mean, this is the most historic cemetery in New York City. She's right near Herman Melville and E.L. Doctorow, and a lot of women tied into the suffrage movement. So she's in a very historic spot, but also, if you come up to visit, you can go on a tour of other great New Yorkers, people like Duke Ellington and Miles Davis, Nellie Bly. So it's really nice to have her in what they call a forever place, rather than where she was previously, which was a little bit off the beaten path.
I'd like to talk a bit about your website and a particular posting there. There is an interview, radio interview, that she gave a year before she died. And it is, I found disturbing, remarkable, her candor, her just flat out candor about renouncing her former life or what she was a famous, the Algonquin Round Table. Talk about that.
It's very interesting. I'm glad you mentioned this interview. I mean, you can just picture her sitting there smoking a cigarette with her poodle there, on the Upper East Side. She had been disavowing her past for many years. She was really not happy with being known as a wisecracker or a witch. She really wanted to be thought of as a very serious-minded writer and person. So everything that she was famous for from the Jazz Age, of being a member of the Round Table, of going to speakeasies with Robert Benchley, she completely disavowed. But she'd been doing that for many years, starting in World War II, I guess it was.
I want to quote from her from the radio interview. She said about the Round Table, she said, "There was no truth in anything they said. They came there to be heard by one another. People look at it rosily now, and it wasn't. It was the terrible day of the wisecrack, so there didn't have to be any truth. There's nothing memorable about them, about any of them," obviously including herself.
Sure. Well, it's funny because of the whole group, the 30 members, Parker and Edna Ferber are the only people still in print. All those other writers, their books are not in print. Some of their plays, you'd be very hard-pressed to find them. Except for George S. Kaufman and a couple of the others, they really have kind of fallen by the wayside today. And I think it's because they were telling jokes and saying witty things that are very ephemeral. But what Parker and Ferber were writing about is still popular today, because they were talking about the human condition, about getting your heart broken, and matters like that.
Well, I think she pointed out that none of the leading lights, perhaps we should call them, of literature at the time ever came to the Round Table.
No.
Hemingway, Faulkner.
Theodore Dreiser, no, they were busy working. They're actually making art at the time. But think about going to lunch with your friends every 6 days a week for 7 or 8 years. I mean, it's kind of an incredible feat to even do that sort of thing.
I guess one of her most famous quips is men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses. And in that radio interview, she just moans and says, "Oh, I wish I had never written those silly, lying words."
Well, she disavowed all of her light verse. She was following, she said, in the footsteps of Edna St. Vincent Millay. And the funny thing is, Millay now is pretty much overlooked as a poet, and she was a better poet than Parker was. But Parker's stock has really risen since her death in 1967, where Millay's definitely has not.
That's an interesting point. What do you think of her popularity today and her works?
If you were to go on Instagram right now, there are tens of thousands of Parker quotes and references. When she died, her book, The Portable Dorothy Parker, was in print, so she's never went out of print. But now, all of her poems, her fiction, her Broadway reviews, those have all come back into publication. She's more popular today than she was in 1967. People get Dorothy Parker tattoos all the time. There was just a show in Paris that sold out, of a one-woman show in French of Parker's work. And this happens all over the world. There's multiple translations, probably 20 different languages of Parker's work. It's really has been growing and growing every year. In the 20-plus years that I've been on the Parker, fan beat, I've been seeing quite a few more members. We have about 7,000, members of the Dorothy Parker Society today, and they come from all walks of life, from all over the globe. It's pretty impressive.
When you say there, if I went on Instagram, I'll see all kinds of quotes, but how many of those are the quips, the lethal wit?
Yes, so people are taking a lot of what she said, not so much out of context, but using it in their own way, whether it's to talk about their dogs or their boyfriends or their outlook at life. There's a Parker quote for every day of the week, it seems like.
But does that mitigate what you said before, that people are coming to her equally or even greater to her serious writing, or are they concentrating on the stuff she disavowed?
To me, as someone who just wants to have people reading Parker, buying Parker books, and keeping her in print, it doesn't matter so much if you find out about her through a joke or a quip or a quote. If you're going to seek her out and say, well, who is this person that has their own gin, that has all these books, I want to read them. There's references to Parker on pop culture then I want to go out and get the book. That is what makes me happy.
What can you say about what she thought in retrospect about the people of the Round Table?
Well, she really kind of looked askance, looked at her early days and kind of was embarrassed about that because she really wanted to be seen as a serious person. You know, her FBI file is this thick, and that's for all of the left-wing causes and her political activism that she started doing in the 20s and 30s. She wanted to be known as a person who was serious and who was writing about subjects like, you know, the Civil War in Spain and racial intolerance. So she really did not want to be seen as someone who was writing about, you know, drinking and getting her heart broken and things like that. She was very clear that the only person that she really, you know, respected from that era was Haywood Broun, the columnist, and Robert Benchley. The rest, you know, like Kaufman and Mark Connolly, she just really had no use for because she just thought of them as, you know, silly kind of people.
Kevin, you're amazing.
Thanks.
I really enjoyed this, and I thank you.
Thanks, Tony. It's great to see you today.
And thank you, folks, for watching. We'll see you next week.
I wished on the moon for something I never knew. Wished on the moon for more than I ever knew. I wished on the moon